everyone, and welcome to AWS Julie. For today's video, we are continuing with our new series on needed AWS fundamentals to ensure you pass your AWS certification exams. Let's dive into and learn what makes an AWS service public or private. In this lesson, I want to talk about the architecture for public and private AWS services. So what do you think AWS means when they label a service as public or private? Well, it's probably not what you're thinking. AWS determines a service is private or public by its network, and this is something I really struggled with when I was starting out. So what is an AWS public service? Well, a public service is a service that can be connected to from anywhere that there is an internet connection. Let's look at this diagram. So inside of AWS, we have an AWS public zone, and this public zone can communicate openly with the public internet, and AWS public services sit inside this public zone. Now, this is not the public internet. Remember that AWS has its own network, and the AWS public zone sits inside AWS, but it sits adjacent or sits beside the public internet. And inside of AWS and inside of this AWS public zone is a network that is attached directly to the public internet. So any AWS service that is considered a public service sits and runs from this public zone with the network attached to the open internet. An example of an AWS public service is Amazon S3. So when users are connecting to an S3 bucket, they are connecting through the public internet. Now, what is an AWS private service? Well, a private AWS service sits and lives inside the AWS private zone. And you will see it has no direct connection to the open internet or the AWS public zone. And inside of the AWS private zone, we can create an isolated environment like an Amazon VPC or create an EC2 instance. And by default, this is completely isolated. But we can add permissions for our EC2 instance or for our VPC to access the public zone or the public internet. We simply have to configure the routing and make the instance public, and we'll be going much deeper into this later on in the series. And by default, until you add permissions and routes to the internet or to the AWS public zone, the only services that can access the services inside the AWS private zone are services inside the AWS private zone. There are no permissions for the private zone except for the local routes. And as we go through this series, we will be discussing AWS services and whether they are private or public. This is an important fundamental because you may see some exam questions asking how to give a user or customer access to a specific AWS service. And if you understand what makes a service a public AWS service or a private AWS service, you will understand also how to design that connectivity. And then you'll be able to confidently answer any questions that you see on your exam. If you found this content useful, a like and a subscribe would mean a lot to me. It really helps me know what y'all like, and it gives me an indicator that I'm building useful content that really helps. Now, we just mentioned VPCs and how they sit inside the AWS private zone. Well, in our next video, we are going to do a high-level overview of the core AWS services and touch on needed fundamentals for each, but we will be diving deeper into the fundamentals or these core services later on in this series. But in our next lesson, we will look at the fundamentals of an Amazon VPC. Thanks so much for watching.